today we're going to talk about polishing an academic paper, or how the most effective way to self-revise and why that's important. So why do we want to polish a paper or attempt a self-revision? Well, there are a number of reasons why this is incredibly important. The first is factual, that there have been a number of studies that show when you engage in the writing process, so brainstorming, getting a draft together, spending time revising, you are actually engaging in the learning process. So when you write about something, you actually learn about it in a different way. So that's why part of the reason why we write about ideas is that we can engage with those ideas in a different way and learn more. This is a great activity to practice putting yourself in someone else's shoes, or our book calls it, I believe, the make-believe game. By sitting down and self-revising, we are now the reader, and so that's a new perspective that we can add to our paper. We are practicing being the reader, and hopefully then we can also practice to be different readers, meaning we'll bring in new perspectives to our writing. As we self-revise, we'll read as someone else, pretend to be somebody else, and asks critical questions. Do I need to add a clarification sentence here? Or this is actually very confusing. Reader might need more help, more assistance here. So we can bring in new perspectives to our writing by putting ourselves in someone else's shoes. Writing also gets your personal ideas and thoughts out to contribute to the conversation, or what others think and their ideas. And ultimately, only you know what you mean. Workshops are incredibly helpful to get another perspective, but sometimes, even in a workshop, a reader might not understand what you are saying because you know exactly what you're saying, your words make sense, but they might not make sense to the reader. And ultimately, we want to engage in self-revision because we know what we mean, we know what ideas and thoughts we want to get out on paper. We want to make sure that we do that effectively and in the best way possible. Which leads to our last point, that you want to represent those ideas and yourself fairly, accurately, and honestly. Sometimes things get lost in translation from your brain, from your ideas to paper. There is a loss of information. And so self-revision helps to make sure that we are representing those ideas correctly and not misrepresenting ourselves. So where do we start when it comes to self-revision? One of the best places to start is by looking at the sentences and paragraphs that make up the paper. Ultimately, you can look at writing as very clinical, very mathematical. And when you break down a paper, it is sentences that are put together that result in paragraphs, and those paragraphs are put together to create a paper. So when we look at those sentences, we want to make sure that we have independent clauses versus dependent clauses. Independent clauses are full sentences. It's a noun, a verb, and a complete thought. Whereas a dependent clause is not, it's a sentence fragment, and it's not able to stand on its own. So I wrote the paper is an independent clause. It's not a really great one. It's not very interesting. But following it, which I see quite frequently, is I have a sentence that starts with which is surprising. And this is a dependent clause. It cannot just be its own sentence like it is there. It needs to, it starts with a conjunction, and it needs to join with an independent clause. So we want to make sure we watch out for sentences that start with conjunctions, either subordinating or coordinating. Which, than, when, since, also, until, though, even. Those are frequently the worst offenders. They start sentences and are dependent clauses, but we tend to treat them as independent, as their own sentence. So we need to watch out for those sentences. So if I combine those two clauses together, I wrote the paper, which is surprising. It's a little more interesting of a sentence, a little more complex, and we don't have a sentence fragment. Now, also at the sentence level, besides making sure we actually have sentences and not fragments, we should also strive for strong action verbs. We want to avoid weak action verbs and passive voice, because both of those structures make our sentences uninteresting and shift around who's doing the action. So passive voice, you can see a great example here, that the car is driving on the road. Well, we aren't at that point yet. I'll have to revise this lecture in a few short years when we do have self-driving cars, and they're very common, and the cars are driving on the road. But right now, cars need someone to operate them. So the car is being driven by a person. So you're taking action with this passive construction. You're taking action away from the actor, the person driving the car, and giving it to the car, which is just a inanimate object that is being manipulated. So the second sentence gives the action where action is due. The wheelman drove the car on the road. The student drove the car. My mother drove the car on the road. And then we can make that action more interesting. Did they drive? Did they peel out of a parking lot? They speed down the road. And so we can use strong action verbs to give action where action is due, also through avoiding passive construction. So those two can go hand in hand. We want to give the action, give our reader a sense of who is doing the action effectively, and we do that through strong action verbs and avoiding passive voice. So as we're slowly going through our paper and we've looked at our sentences, we want to make sure we look at how our sentences come together in paragraphs. And there are a few overviews of how we might make sure our paragraphs make sense. And one of the general guiding principles is that for each paragraph, you just have one idea. And that idea is revealed in the first sentence, in a topic sentence. And that topic sentence relates back to the thesis or the overarching argument of the paper. And then you give 3 to 5 sentences of details, examples, and evidence that directly support that topic sentence before transitioning into the next idea. It is very straightforward. We tend to complicate our paragraphs, make them unnecessarily long, go off on tangents, cram multiple ideas into a single paragraph. A paragraph can be as short as 5 sentences and be very effective, be a very good paragraph. Sometimes paragraphs naturally will be longer. They'll be 10 sentences, 20 sentences, and that's fine, as long as it all relates to that single idea. Our paragraph length depends on how complex our idea is. Sometimes our idea has multiple facets that we have to unravel, point 1A, 1B, and 1C. Sometimes we just have one idea. So if we stick to that idea of one idea is one paragraph, and we follow this basic structure, we have at least a topic sentence, we have examples and evidence that support that topic sentence, and before we transition into the next idea, that'll help keep our paragraphs very focused. And within paragraphs, we want to make sure we watch out for shifts in verb tense or point of view. I'll go into detail a little more on this the next slide about this, but typically per paragraph, we have one idea and we have one tense. We either are in the past tense or we are in the present tense. We don't shift between past and present. There are rare exceptions to this rule, but because paragraphs tend to be so short and so focused, shifting between past and present is far too confusing. And then something that is incredibly important also is shifts in point of view, to avoid shifting between first, second, and third person. Now, if we just do not use third person at all, that is incredibly, it can be incredibly easy to throw in second person. It's you and your all the time. If students don't pay attention, you need to know that you will not do well in class. Well, that's a shift in point of view. As we see in the examples here, students can be incredibly knowledgeable if you pay attention in class. That is a shift in point of view from third person, students, into second person, you. So you might think, okay, I'll just go through and substitute one, which is third person academic jargon. Instead of you, I'll just say one might. But then we also get a problem, and you'll see that in the second sentence. students can be incredibly knowledgeable if one pays attention in class. I just substituted one for you and second person, and it's a good sentence, right? Wrong. We now have a shift in number. So students is plural, but one is singular. So that is one of the biggest problems in just going through and substituting in one for all of your second person you, is that it typically causes issues in number. So now our third sentence here, students can be incredibly knowledgeable if they pay attention in class, is what we strive for, because students and they are both third person plural, and they match, and we don't have an unnecessary shift in point of view. So based on these basic levels for sentences and paragraphs, there are also a number of MVP errors I see all the time. So things to do not. The point of view is probably the biggest error. You'll notice I've just crossed off second person. You, your, yours, yourself. There should never be second person in a paper, at least in the context of our course. And I've actually rarely seen you in academic papers at all, because a you is a direct address to the audience. And when you write a paper, you're writing to multiple readers. You're not just writing to a singular you. So using you in second person does not make sense in academic writing at all. We've talked about intentional first person usage with I statements, and we'll talk a little more about that. So we want to make sure that when we use I and me, my, our, we, any of those forms, it's intentional, and it is based off of a strong usage that our book encourages. Most importantly, we should stay in third person, but the biggest issue with third person is that you shift between singular he or she and they and them in a single sentence. So we need to make sure that if we are talking about a single author, Addison, we'll use her correct pronoun, she, her, hers, and her, and not go into a they. Or also just Goldsmith, his pronouns is he. Make sure we're not referencing Goldsmith as a she or a they. So we have to make sure that when we use third person, the trickiest part is just making sure our number and our pronoun align. So, like I said, if it's a woman and her pronouns are she, her, hers, and herself, those will be what we use. Now, I talked about these as well. Verb tense, we want to make sure we're not shifting. This is also very common to go between past and present. And we always talk about writing in present tense in MLA because ideas live forever. Plato might be dead, but we are still referencing his ideas. So we always talk about works of writing in present tense. So, even though Harry Potter was written, 2 decades ago, we would still talk about it as if it's relevant because it still is relevant. So think of it that way. And you'll see I give a couple examples of basic, today I walk, I stay in present tense, I walk. Present participle is I am walking now, I'm in the process of doing it. And then past is I walked. It was a one and done, I'm done walking. And past participle is I have walked. I have walked over a period of time. So besides shifts in point of view and verb tense, we also have issues with commas. So we want to make sure we always use commas with an introductory element, with added details, or when we're using a list. And you'll notice I've bolded and put in red the commas I've used. The first example is use of introductory elements. First, I will discuss my love of cats. Then, I will describe my sister's dog. Finally, I will explain how my cat is the best. Now, we don't need first, then, and finally. I could just say, I will discuss my love of cats. I will describe my sister's dog. I will explain how my cat is the best. However, when we use first, then, and finally, those are showing a relationship of ideas. I will do this first, then I will talk about that. Lastly, I will end with this idea. So we're showing how this might flow or flesh out. So we need those introductory elements to have commas. Now, a similar thing is the added details, which are the second sentence. My class, Composition 2, is writing intensive. Do I need Composition 2? No, I could just say my class is writing intensive. You, as a student in Composition 2, will know what class I'm talking about because you are taking it. I, as the instructor, know what I'm talking about. But if this lecture video gets viewed by anyone else, they'll be wondering what class I'm talking about. So I'm using commas on both ends of my clarifying detail to bookend. And it's kind of like I'm inserting this element and I can take it out. So if I took it out, I would remove both commas, but it's the commas are used to add detail, but to also show you what I could remove and it would still be a sentence. So that Composition 2 adds a clarifying detail. Lastly, we want to make sure we use commas in a list. So you'll see in Composition 2, students will write 3 papers, 1 research proposal, and 4 reflections. You'll see I actually used an introductory element in Composition 2. Once again, I could remove that. Students will write 3 papers, and you'll need to understand. And then you'll notice that a comma comes before the final and. So that's called the Oxford comma, and in MLA, it's pretty standard that the Oxford comma is used. So make sure that we use commas to separate out each individual item we are listing. We also have what I call source sentences when we summarize, paraphrase, or quote. And those tend to have a very set formula. And this might be familiar to some of you from Composition 1, but we always introduce one of our source sentences with a signal phrase that starts to let our readers know we are transitioning into words and ideas that are not originally our own. Then we give the source itself. If it's a direct quote, we'll make sure to use quotation marks, or if it's a summary or paraphrase, we won't, because those are our words. We're just using our words to showcase somebody else's ideas. Then we will also cite the source. And you'll notice our citation is very, very important. And it's very important to have it properly formatted as well. And then after that sentence, we'll spend time to analyze or explain the significance of that source. This is also called the sandwich by our textbook, that you have the signal or introduction, you give the source and citation, and then you explain it or you provide the analysis. So we want to make sure we sandwich our source sentences. Every time we have a source, we use this formula, okay? You will always use these elements in introducing a source. Lastly, one of its errors or things we include in papers are meaningless words and in the form of cliches and vague language. So we don't use cliches for a number of reasons, because cliches are informal language, but also cliches don't really mean much to a broad reading audience. So that might be because your readers are not from the same area or same country. They really don't mean much. Because I'm originally from Wisconsin, and I travel 3 hours away to cross over Iowa, and I use a lot of cliches and slang that I grew up with, and people here have no idea what I'm talking about. So cliches tend to use up a lot of word space, but they don't really mean much at all. That's the way the cookie crumbles. It's not all sunshine and rainbows. Those things, you use a lot of words, but they aren't descriptive, and they don't really provide a lot of meaning. And the same thing with vague language. People, thing, it, everyone, everything, everybody, all. We tend to throw these words in, especially in our introduction, to say everybody has had to write a paper before. Well, who is this everybody? Because actually, a lot of people haven't had to write a paper for school. So maybe say, students, or, modern students in the 21st century, students in the digital age. There are a lot of ways we can clarify who these people, everyone, everything, everybody that we are talking about, that really bring up the quality of our paper. So we kind of have a do not list. So what should we focus on to do besides correcting maybe these errors? What should we focus on as a to do? Well, we should show the relationship between ideas. This is sometimes what we call flow, at least what I consider flow. And this is one element to automatically beef up your paper and take it to the next level. We don't want to just link sentences with and because, or just have very short individual sentences. But we want to use conjunctions to show relationships between clauses. So we have coordinating conjunctions, we have subordinating conjunctions. These are some of the two best ways to show relationships between independent clauses or independent clauses and dependent clauses. So coordinating conjunctions link two equal ideas or independent clauses, meaning that the two ideas aren't dependent on each other to survive, okay? They could function as two separate sentences. It would make sense, but it doesn't quite show how the ideas relate to each other. So a great one I use a lot is however, which kind of qualifies what follows. The Second Amendment guarantees Americans the right to bear arms. However, should automatic and semi-automatic weapons be included? I could just start the sentence with should automatic and semi-automatic weapons be included, but it doesn't show the relationship of that second independent idea to the first independent idea. I'm talking about the Second Amendment, but I'm asking a question if that qualifies the right to bear arms. This is a discussion on if semi-automatic weapons and automatic weapons should be included. So those ideas are related to each other. Another great word is otherwise or even either or. If I don't write this paper, I will get a 0. Okay. That is true. That is a correct sentence. But let's take a look at the next sentence. I will write this paper, otherwise I will fail this class. So it's kind of showing that relationship. I need to do this thing or this will be the result. So sometimes then you'll see an either or. Either I write this paper or I will fail this class. The otherwise kind of shows that these two equal ideas are related. They could be their own sentences. That would be okay. But we want to show the relationship between the two ideas. If I don't write this paper, I will fail this class. So either I will write it, otherwise this will be this result. We also have what we call subordinating conjunctions, and these link two unequal ideas or an independent idea and a dependent idea. This means one idea is the main idea, and the other idea is kind of commenting or modifying or somehow relating to somehow changing the independent idea. And we use words like since, although, and which. Writing this paper was hard since the source materials readings were complicated. Writing this paper was hard, although there were a variety of resources available. Writing this paper was hard, which resulted in, and you fill in the blank, resulted in me working harder, resulted in a bad grade. What did that result in? So we can use different subordinating conjunctions to show the relationship. Writing this paper was hard. Why? Because the source material. So instead of using because, we're using since to show that relationship. Although I had a variety of resources available, I still found writing this paper hard. Once again, explaining why writing this paper was hard. And the same thing with the third one, which resulted in, and whatever our result was, writing this paper was hard. We're showing the relationship or modification of that independent clause. We talked about point of view already, but make sure we do use point of view correctly. So no you, second person you, or third person substitutes one. And if we're using first person, those I statements need to be used intentionally from the textbook. So what might this look like? Instead of I believe X is right, I believe Addison is right, that, and you give the idea, just say Addison is right. I agree with the evidence. you can just say the evidence shows. I feel Castleman does not understand. Just say, like Addison is right, just say Castleman does not understand. I think she is correct. Just say Addison is correct or she is correct. I have a problem with Addison's argument. Just say there is a problem. Because you might not be the only one with a problem. Other people might see Addison's argument as problematic. Just state it that there is a problem. I disagree with Addison. You might say students might disagree with Addison. Or, academics or critics might take issue with Addison. There are ways to use third-person language, but a lot of times our I statements are weak. We're just saying, I believe, I agree, I feel, I think, I have a problem, I disagree, and we don't need those things in an academic paper because you are the writer. Your reader knows that, and so they know when you say Addison is right, they know that is your opinion. They know that's what you are, what you believe. So you don't need the I believe as part of that sentence. So once again, you can use the I statement as long as it is effective and intentional and not just a tool to encourage subjective, self-indulgent opinions, as our book calls them. So we have a few examples of intentional I statements. Adding to Addison's argument, I would point out that, and then you add what you're adding to the conversation. My view, however, contrary to what Castleman has argued, is that, and then you insert your contribution. For a comparative analysis like this, I would see 3 I statements at most. You either agree or disagree with Addison's argument, or you add something. You agree, disagree, or add something to Castleman, and then you might have an I statement where it's your belief, your thesis, your conclusion. So that is what we're shooting for: 3 intentionally crafted I statements at most. And lastly, this is a reminder as well, this might look familiar, but we want to use the textbook. So especially for this unit, we want to look at what they say. So those quote sandwiches with citations and strong signal verbs. No uses of they think, Addison says, Castleman talks about, all those weaker verbs. We want to focus on the arguments, not the articles themselves. Then we want to effectively learn how to say I say. Do I disagree, agree, or do both? And why? What do I contribute? Be focusing on these they say, I say pairs. Make sure your arguments are supported by evidence. And you use any clear voice markers to distinguish between what you are thinking and say versus Castleman, Addison, or other critics. When we are introducing naysayers, we want to make sure we address the common objections fairly and persuasively, and make sure that we include other perspectives as well. And as always, with everything we write, we need to make the case for why your argument matters and who should care about that argument.